live the way we do. If you don't, go somewhere else.
We have heard of a large number of cults and cult leaders and their various nefarious acts over the years. Charles Manson was someone who ended up having a massive influence, and some people still believe that he made sense. It's scary to imagine what power can do to a person leading a cult, and how far they can take the idea of their influence on their followers. We saw this version with the take on Osho's cult in Wild Wild Country. HBO's The Synanon Fix will take us to one such cult that managed to cause quite an uproar in the 60s and 70s. Before we binge into the crazy story of Synanon, let's take a look at this cult and how it managed to earn its reputation. Before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
But one of the wisest persons that I've ever met in my life.
Who is Charles Dederich? Synanon's name might evoke memories of various infamous events and accounts, but the original plans for this community were utterly different. The founder of this movement, Charles E. Dederich, was a story similar to that of John McAfee or Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. Unlike these other leaders, though, Charles Dederich had an unfortunate beginning before he planned to turn his Californian discussion group from Alcoholics Anonymous to a group that would be able to expiate their habitual behaviors and tendencies. Dederich, a Gulf oil sales executive based in Toledo, Ohio, just had a divorce with his first wife. Even though it's not certain if it was because of his confessed heavy drinking tendencies, this drinking tendency grew out of his bout with meningitis that ended up requiring a mastoidectomy, resulting in half of his face being caved in. After parting ways with his first wife, he moved to Southern California, which led to his meeting with his second wife, Ruth Jason. Even though Ruth wouldn't last long with Dederich, she introduces him to Beverly Hills AA, and it's here that everything changes. Upon visiting here, Dederich would undergo a complete change in his persona, as he would find a means to give up on alcohol and become significantly influenced by their methodology. He would actively participate and get involved with the organization, doing various tasks over the years. However, over time, he realized this would result in an opposing trajectory regarding his relationship with the organization. Just like alcoholics, Dederich felt that even drug addicts needed this type of therapy to help them change their ways. Back in the 50s, the only two possible solutions for addiction included straitjacketing, which meant imposing severe restrictions, and solitary confinement. Still, neither of these methods turned out to be solid, and there was hardly any effect on the individuals. Dederich felt that they needed to be imposed to change their ways, with the thought that they needed to rely on themselves rather than anything or anyone else. But this required a strong leader, at least someone who could sway these people with his words, and based on his story, he could make for an exciting addition to that aspect. Weighing over 300 pounds, Dederich was an imposing figure. His twitching right side of his face, with a mostly shut right eye because of the meningitis treatment, added to his persona. But this wasn't the only thing that helped, since these people needed a leader, and his speech and motivation towards bringing a change into the lives of these people would be what would get the much-needed impact he hoped for. But the very people who influenced him at first stood in his way because the AA people didn't believe in this type of rehabilitation for drug addicts. In return, Charles was only a little hyped into certain aspects of the AA, including their categorizing mentality and solid religious associations. Dederich parted ways with the organization in 1958 and started working on his approach toward his rehabilitation near Santa Monica. Now, we will get to his sales executive approach, which comes into play when selling this idea. Initially, he named his group TLC, which stood for Tender Loving Care, but later he would change it to a different world that would earn a reputation. While playing with the names Synthesize and Synagogue, he realized that he would have to stick to something similar. Upon hearing a person with an addiction failing to pronounce the terms symposium and seminar, Dederich would finally find the word he was looking for, Synanon. He and his friends would try to approach different ways of spelling the word, and finally stick to the infamous version. Dederich felt that the word looked good when put on the side of a truck. This particular scenario won't be the only time Dederich would create a whole new word, since this very approach would become a significant part of how he invoked the sense that he wanted to with people with an addiction. Being a semanticist of sorts, Dederich believed that changing the name of something would directly result in bringing a change to the person. Later, many new words will be introduced during his workings to represent new beliefs and practices. Synanon was founded in September 1958, and Dederich took an experimental approach during these early years to discover the approach he needed to take to cure these people. Word of mouth would be the primary means of spreading the name amongst the people, and it did have a considerable impact. A giant fee of $1,000 would be taken from these people to show their commitment and dedication to their recovery. However, the early days didn't look suitable for this group, as a certain appeal didn't work out, even though people managed to join in large numbers.
Synanon was a golden child of the world.
How did Synanon start? Early experiments brought into this group would not see much success amongst the dope fiends, as Dederich called them. This would primarily be because, in most cases, the people would relapse after the 2-year residential program. Another reason would be that there were times when these people were using drugs while being a part of Synanon, but they did face some financial success, and eventually, Synanon purchased a beachside hotel in Santa Monica, Club Casa del Mar. This won't be the end, since sometime later, they managed to acquire a large building in Oakland, California, and turn it into a residential facility for the members. People with a substance use disorder weren't the only people who came and took part in Synanon, as later, some of the healthcare professionals like psychologists were also invited so that they could have their insight into the process. One included Daniel Casriel, MD, who stayed with them and later wrote a book about his experience with them. This book would provide us with much needed insight into the group's heydays. Staying there impacted Daniel since he founded Arriba, one of the best private addiction treatment centers to date. Over time, many exciting practices were developed that would see a slow and gradual change in the members. There was a prayer that later became quite popular, and it was recited every morning following the meetings. It went like this: "Please let me first and always examine myself. Let me be honest and truthful. Let me seek and assume responsibility. Let me understand rather than be understood. Let me trust and have faith in myself and my fellow man. Let me love rather than be loved. Let me give rather than receive." One can see how the prayer aimed to achieve the self-reliance aspect that Dederich was driving towards. However, the most effective approach was the game, where people would bare themselves before other members to gain insight and find a new way to look at themselves. The approach was directed toward making people utilize the energy that they spent suppressing themselves into something a lot more constructive for the individual. During the 2 to 3 hour thrice-in-a-week sessions, the individuals would open themselves up to gossip about their points of view to other members. This might draw criticism from the person they're facing during the particular scenario, leading to a heavy back and forth, but in the end, it would derive empathy toward the individual being played at and the person drawing the criticism. Dederich brought recreation for the individuals, which was quite an exciting step, as it wasn't considered recreation. The members would often view cinema and create various arts and craft projects, including working on their musical aspects. Again, doing this only helped them open themselves and present their unique perspectives, which was much needed as a part of the treatment. Over time, the group would become one of the most famous religious groups that followed Dederich's school of thought, and earned quite a reputation. The other churches of thought that exist till now face quite a lot of negativity, like Scientology and the others, but Synanon managed to get most of the positive influence, even though most of their work was being done, considering that it was legal and even taxation was lifted because of their benefit to society. Around 1964, specific investigations proved things otherwise. Other treatment facilities had a fixed timeline for keeping their patients. Still, Synanon had imposed lifetime rehabilitation, which would be the first big step for the group toward the gray area. Then there would be the issue regarding the variety of properties and lands worked upon without legal permits. Finally, there would be cases of harassment and brutal beatings upon certain members that would bring to light the dark things at play inside the community. How did it become a violent cult? On October 10, 1978, Paul Morantz, an attorney, had just returned home and put his left hand inside his mailbox to discover something lumpy. Before he could come to an understanding, the rattlesnake inside his mailbox bit him, and he resorted to screaming for his life. Later, he would survive this attack when a neighbor came along and applied a tourniquet to save his life. But even then, he would end up being hospitalized for 6 days. The snake's rattle was removed so it couldn't make the sound, and the victim would remain unsuspecting. This would be amongst the numerous violent moves made by Synanon to stop people from spreading the truth about the now dangerous cult. Over time, the power and influence that Dederich had over these people got to him, and he ended up using violence as a means of their idea of retaliation. He formed an internal group called the Imperial Marines, which was responsible for most of the violent acts conducted by the group. The first target of these attacks included those members who parted ways with the group, and the attacks would be ruthless. Then there would be those who tried to investigate the group's modus operandi. In the late 1970s, NBC ran a show that uncovered the various controversial aspects of Synanon, and the group didn't let this jab go unpunished, as they managed to send a variety of threats using the mass following they had. This comes as quite a surprise, considering the group was primarily known to have quite a non-violent approach toward various attacks. There was even a time when a gang of people entered their facilities and beat up some of the residents while the others tried to talk them down, but the very change that led to them taking a violent approach was something that Dederich took very personally. internally. During one of the weekly gaming sessions, a woman continued to harass his wife, Betty Dederich, and this led to him heading out with a can of beer in his hand. The mere idea that he was going against everything he stood for made the people stand against this move, but this made him realize that he had to change the ways of the group, and it would only be a month later that all the group members sought gun permits. Another primary reason for their deflection from their principles was when Synanon established the Punk Squad, which included most juvenile criminals. These people tended to go into their means of getting things done, and it was decided that this would be used for Synanon's organizational benefit. However, the discussion should have included the entire idea of how this would impact the group. These kids had no interest in the original views of the group, and instead wanted to contribute in their own way, which led to violent outbursts. At the same time, Synanon would treat them horribly, with new rules invoked when they were made to play the game, including physical attacks. Often, severe punishments would be implemented on the kids who failed to live up to the specific goals that the group defined. These violent issues were what ended up promoting the violent outbursts that they explored to attack their opponents. In 1977, Paul Morantz received a call from a man who told him about how his wife had joined the Synanon for rehab, but things had taken a drastic turn. They had shaved her head and didn't let her leave the group, only to take her to one of the other locations where the community was based. Morantz decided he would take up the case, and proceeded to win a $300,000 judgment against Synanon. As a result, Synanon took revenge by planting a snake in his mailbox, but this only ended up provoking the police, who were already discussing with Morantz the actions they would take against Synanon. The police managed to catch the two criminals responsible for the attack on Morantz, and also managed to get a hold of Dederich under the charge of conspiracy to murder. A drunk Dederich would be taken into custody on December 2nd, 1978, and the charges against him were pretty easy to prove, considering Dederich tended to record everything he did. With their leader gone, the group couldn't survive the further stabs into their reputation that proved that they had lost. Synanon finally dissolved in 1991, when Dederich was kept under probation because his doctors determined he was sick and prison would only lead to his death. On February 28, 1997, Dederich died because of a cardiorespiratory failure. In the later years, a lot of research was brought to light that Dederich's specific methods had a positive outcome, which would only help them further the growth of the individuals. The aggressive game is still used for addiction treatment methods. It's pretty bizarre that, under all the madness that the world saw, there were specific methods that made sense.
Has been an offense, and our offense is very offensive.
Marvelous verdict. Charles Dederich is another case of Icarus. He flew too close to the sun and ruined the reputation of an entire school of thought that had a positive impact. Funnily enough, for someone working with the concept of accepting the self, his hubris caused his demise, which would not be easily forgotten. But this is a story that needs to be told. A story that just goes to show that an individual has the strength and the power to move people. It is easy to be swayed by particular perspectives and forget the natural way. If only Synanon believed in their original school of thought, things would have been quite different today. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.